So I guess we will get started after all. So I'm going to talk a little bit about metadata templates. Some of you have heard me talk about metadata templates before or have implemented metadata templates on your own before. So this may not be news to everyone in the room, but that's okay. But to start off, just to talk about iRODS and metadata. So metadata is an important part of the iRODS infrastructure. So we connect the unstructured data in iRODS, these files, we put metadata on them so we can do interesting things with them. So you can use, obviously, for data discovery, you can use the metadata to find the data that you care about in your iRODS catalog. You can trigger actions to find in the iRODS rule engine, or in the latest and greatest new technology, you can use that to drive computation. And Jason may comment on that at some point, I don't know, but we wanted to put that in there. And before I go on, it's a casual meeting, so if anything isn't clear or you want to stop me and talk about anything, just go ahead and yell out, and I'll stop and try to answer your questions. So, iRODS already has metadata. Why do we need metadata templates? So in iRODS, default iRODS, out of the box, the only metadata you get are ABU triples of strings. So that's the only way metadata is represented in iRODS. So if you want to do something more interesting, if you want to even have something that is an integer and you can be sure that it is an integer, as opposed to somebody's name that they typed into the integer field, we need to extend that functionality. But we don't want to re-implement at the base level how iRODS actually handles metadata. We don't want to re-architect all of metadata in iRODS, so we want to work with these ABU triples of strings in a way that provides additional functionality. So for example, up here, you might want to require that everybody who uploads an image to your database has the latitude and longitude of where the image was taken, for example. But in iRODS as it exists now, there's no way to make sure, you may be able to make sure that somebody attaches an attribute latitude via rules, but there's no convenient way to make sure that they actually bother to put in a latitude value for it. So that's one example of the things that you can do with metadata templates, or that you will be able to do with metadata templates. So in the context of iRODS, metadata templates are JSON files, JavaScript object notation, just a standard way of representing data, JSON, that maps metadata triples to more detailed information about their values. So I have some examples up here. You might be able to indicate that a given ABU is part of Dublin core metadata, so that you can go back and look later and say, show me all the Dublin core metadata for this data object. We can do that. You can say that it was added to this, a given ABU was added to the object by me or by whomever, or that it's automatically updated based on data in the iRODS catalog. So you can have these metadata fields associated with your data objects and your collections in iRODS. So what can you do? One thing that you can do is you can interact with ABUs in a user-friendly interface by providing guidance to UIs. So over here we have a data object connected with some ABUs that are just represented as ABU triples of strings. But over here, we know, for example, that an integer must fall within a range. So if you have a range of integers, that naturally maps onto a slider. So you can take something that was previously just a string and associate that with a slider in the graphical user interface. So if you're using, for example, coming down the pipe with iRODS Cloud Browser in the future, we might incorporate metadata templates and be able to do these sorts of things. So we can attach sliders or checkboxes or things that more naturally map to the data type that you're actually trying to put into your ABU. So that's one thing you can do with metadata templates. A second thing that you can do is standardize the metadata that's associated with a given collection or a given zone or a given resource in iRODS. So you can say, as a curator, anytime somebody puts a new data object into this collection, it must have Dublin Core metadata associated with it, or it must have latitude, longitude associated with it. So you can make sure that your data is well annotated before it even arrives in your catalog. And it also, you can use this sort of the converse of that, which is if you have a lot of data that are going to have the same metadata associated with them. Say if I want to put owner me on every file that I've ever put into iRODS, I can put that into a metadata template and apply that template to all my files, and it would update, all my files with the appropriate metadata. That it was created by me, and I want a BSD3 license associated with it, and whatever other information I might want to have on all of my files. So rather than having to go in and individually hand edit metadata for every data object that you have, you can use metadata templates. And also, we have this idea of being able to require metadata elements on your data objects or collections or zones or users or wherever you may be putting metadata, and to validate those metadata elements with respect to their types and values. So this is what I was talking about earlier. You can be sure that a latitude value contains latitude. And you don't have to write a rule to do that. You can just write a type and say that this is an integer and it falls between 0 and 90, right? And then you can have that validated, and you can make sure not only that your users are actually putting metadata on their data objects and collections, but also that they're putting meaningful metadata on there. If you're expecting an integer, you can make sure that you get an integer. If you're expecting a date time, you can make sure that you're getting a date time. So from here, I'll just start talking about the metadata schema that we have. It's available on GitHub. These slides are also available on slides.com, so if you don't want to write down this link, you don't have to. You can go look at the slides later. But we have a JSON schema associated with metadata templates. It consists of the following properties. It's pretty straightforward. Some of these I'm going to talk a little bit more in the coming slides. It's got a name, it's got an author, it's got a version. You can say whether or not it's required. If a metadata template is required, any user who uploads something has to populate the fields of this metadata template. If it's not required, it's just a convenience function. So we can provide Dublin Core as a non-required metadata template. You can use it if you want to, if it makes your life easier. If you think it's important to have Dublin Core metadata on your data objects. If you don't think it's important, you don't have to use it if it's not marked as required. So the type is an enum that indicates what type of metadata template it is. So currently we only support form-based metadata templates, which is basically data that looks like HTML forms. So it could be, it's all user input, and it's generally things that can be mapped to sliders or text boxes or checkboxes or radio buttons. We've discussed adding different types. So for example, we've discussed the idea of getting a metadata template from a schema.org schema for a given type of thing. So you can go to schema.org and get a schema.org person and turn that into a metadata template that can be applied to objects in your iRODS zone. That doesn't exist yet, but that's one of the things that we're talking about. And one of the other ideas that I think would be useful here, if there's anything that you think is important that isn't in there yet, now is a good time. If you have a use case that you think would benefit from metadata templates, but I don't talk about something that's particularly relevant, feel free to speak up. So the source for a metadata template indicates where the data needed to populate that template is going to come from. So currently the only supported source is user, but we've discussed adding additional types. So you could run a rule that produces some output, that populates a field in your metadata template. You could run just a script, run a Unix command, for example, that produces some output that can get piped in, that can get turned into a metadata template. These are things that we've talked about. But again, the only thing that we have implemented so far in our reference implementation is user-driven, form-based metadata templates. The destination indicates how we're actually going to store the metadata template on disk. We talked about how ultimately we need to turn everything into AVU triples that reside on disk. So metadata templates is a layer up from that. So currently the only supported destination is iRODS, indicating that we're going to take this metadata template, we're going to turn it into AVU triples of strings, we're going to jam those into the iRODS catalog. That's going to be the ground truth of metadata for any given data object or collection or zone, etc. We've discussed adding, for example, the ability to, is that a question?
I got a question when you get done, yeah.
Okay. The ability to store metadata in an external Postgres database, which is something that Skarbez does. So you don't necessarily, if you have a fancier way of storing your metadata than using the iRODS catalog, we want to be able to support that. Go ahead, Steve. You had a question.
So in that particular model, Rick, how are you thinking about handling the scenario where for a given user or a given group, I need multiple templates to be in play, and some of those template elements may be the same depending upon which template you're using? If you store them all without some kind of designation in the iRODS ICAT,
Yes.
I don't see how you're going to differentiate them.
Well, so they're differentiated via special strings and UUIDs that are stored in the unit field of the AVU.
Okay.
So every metadata template and every metadata element has a UUID associated with it that is mapped into the unit field of the AVU. So if you have that UUID, you can distinguish between multiple fields that might have the same name.
And you can have an element that is common across templates too, so that you can have a master catalog element. So author in DC might be equal to something else in a different.
Well, that's starting to get into metadata dictionaries. Let's let Rick finish before we get into the weird topics.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked about. We haven't decided how to implement that yet, and I think that's going to be version 2. I won't be involved with the metadata dictionaries, I don't think, but we'll find out. And then we have the metadata elements, the actual metadata that are being stored in this template. Everything else that we were looking at is sort of metadata template metadata. Who created it, and is it required, and what are the sources and destinations associated with it. The elements are the actual metadata of the object that we care about. So we also have a schema for the metadata elements, and the elements consist of this list of properties. Again, several of these I'll discuss in a little bit more detail, but it's got a name, it's got a description, it's got a type, it potentially has a default value, and it has information for how you would validate that metadata element. So type is just the type. It indicates what type of data is going to be stored in that value. So we have some basic raw types, string, text, URL, and these are different in the sense, so string and text, we talked about how metadata templates could be used to give guidance to the UI, right? So string and text map onto the same thing. They're both representing a string, but it might be different in your UI where if you indicate that something is raw text, you might get a text box, a long form data entry UI element, as opposed to string where it might just be a short box. We also have some references, so you could refer to data in the iRODS catalog. You could say, I want the data size of this object to be computed and stored in the metadata of the object, and also some list types. Steve?
Yeah, well, obvious question. How do I add user-defined data types? For example, your latitude, longitude example.
So right now, to do that, you would have to edit the Java. So right now, we don't have a notion of user-defined types.
Okay.
But we should make a note of that as something that people are going to want. and be able to put that in.
Yeah. Weird, this mix, I don't know what, but somebody will think of something we haven't thought of today.
Right. I mean, it would be very easy. It would be easy to do this with sort of additional JSON files. You could have a JSON file that indicates what types are supported and what those types look like. So we have 15 of them or so now. It would not be hard to turn that into something that could be read in at runtime. So that's a good idea and something that I hadn't considered.
We already have the ability to validate that input.
Yeah.
So maybe some kind of plug-in.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was thinking too. But again, I don't want to disrupt this with what the future may look like.
Yeah.
Just let the man finish what he's
Plugin
saying.
architectures.
Yeah, everything is plugins in the future, so we can have a data type plugin, absolutely.
It's plugins and schemas.
It's all schemas now.
So that's what it is. We've got these schemas.
The plugin type plugin.
We've got these plugins. So we have the validation style that indicates how or if an element will be validated. So we previously listed the types. So you can say a metadata element is of type date, for example. And then the validation style indicates how you're going to check if the value of that is correct. So by default, it just checks that it is of the type that you said it is. If you said you required an integer, it had better be something that can be transformed into an integer, or it's going to be rejected. But we've got more sophisticated things where you can have a list where it must be an element of a list. You can have a range for things that have defined ranges. So if you have a numeric value or a date, you can have a range where you just specify the endpoints. And probably the most interesting or the most sophisticated is a regex. You can validate against a regex. So if you wanted someone to put in an email address, you could write a simple email address validator regex or get one off the internet, and it would make sure that somebody put in a valid email or a valid web address or whatever you're sort of worried about. So these are the validation styles. Follow ref is for the reference data types, so it can make sure that what you're pointing at actually exists. So if you're pointing at a URL, we won't necessarily go get the data from it, but we'll just say, yes, this is a URL. You can ping this address. So it's something that's real. Or if you said something in the iRODS catalog, we can say, this is actually a data element that is contained in the iRODS catalog. It'll work if you try to go get it. So the components of the architecture for this, I'm not going to drive super deep into the code level understanding, but there's basically 4 elements of the metadata template architecture. The first is the parser. So we need to be able to turn POJOs into JSON in order to store it on disk and turn JSON into POJOs so we can actually do work with it. POJOs are ordinary Java objects. We have a validator that does the actual validation of the templates and the elements. So is an integer actually an integer? Is an email address actually an email address? Did you fill out all the fields that your curator said that you had to fill out? The resolver, which handles essentially the disk access operations on the actual metadata template files. Can I find a metadata template? Can I create it, update it, delete it? And the exporter, which saves the populated metadata templates. You've done some work in them, maybe in the iRODS cloud browser or whatever user interface that you're working with. And it's exporting that out to your permanent metadata store, whether that's the iRODS catalog or a Postgres database or something else. So these are essentially the 4 bits of code that you need to implement metadata templates. And you can replace one of them without necessarily replacing all of them. So this is a plugin-oriented architecture. If you wanted to use something other than the iRODS catalog, you just need to write a new exporter. You don't need to replace the rest of the infrastructure. Excuse me. And that's really all I have to talk about as far as the slides are concerned. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions or input about the idea of metadata templates?
From a rendering point of view, if you end up with 30 person entries, is that something that the renderer is going to have to filter out, or do you sort of resolve all of that? You were saying that you have UUIDs and everything that map to a particular attribute, and that attribute could be scattered over a number of templates, and those templates could be applied to a collection. So will we get a bunch of persons with the same UUID and the required metadata, and then have to filter that out on the client side, or will you sort of resolve all of the uniquify it, if you will?
It would be possible to do that. Right now, sort of the way, at least that I was thinking about it, and Mike can chime in if he has different thoughts, is that we kind of group the metadata by metadata template. Mm-hmm. So it would be replicated theoretically a bunch of times if you have a bunch of templates that all have the same element, but you could collapse or the way I was thinking about it is that you could collapse or uncollapse each template. Mm-hmm. So if I want to see Dublin Core metadata, I can click on that. It will show me those 14 units, and one of them is author. Mm-hmm. So something else may also contain author.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't think viewing them all in a monolithic list is not really a use case that at least I had considered. So we're grouping them by metadata template in order to make sense of, in order to apply some structure.
Right.
So we would have to, or we don't have to, but the way I'm thinking of is that we would replicate author so that it appears everywhere it's supposed to appear.
Okay, yeah, my concern being that, if you have that many authors, you're going to end up with empty metadata at some point, or they're going to have to type.
Right. So, and I think that goes back to what Mike was mentioning earlier, where if we know that they're all author, if they all have the same UUID or something, we can uniquify on the back end, where we make sure that there's only one real AVU on disk that has this data. You could reference it in multiple places by looking at that UUID.
That violates a dozen provenance rules.
Okay.
Okay, think this through for a moment. If you're going to allow multiple people to have templates, whether you're chaining them or making them into a hierarchy or not, if, say, Jason and I and Justin down there are each created a similar kind of template and use them, when you think about auditing in Providence, when that template gets used, I have to be able to map the UUID on the template back to the actual creator. In fact, actually the creator and the actual instance of the template, or else you can't prove Providence.
That's the way it works.
Yeah.
So everything is about marshaling these things into AVUs. So you have the template and you've got the AVU, and basically the AVU says, I am element this GUID from the metadata template with this GUID. So they are independent.
Okay.
So I think maybe it's not an assumption. This is actually, you can think of the bit of code that actually do that is pretty straightforward, right? To normalize.
Don't get me wrong, but like tell me, I'm a huge fan of data duplication, but this is one time I don't think you can do it and maintain provenance.
That's what I think too. So it is not designed that way. The templates are independent. You can have templates that refer, that can be a computational process, or can have like a little mini query in it. So you can have a metadata template that is not stored even in an AVU, but simply presents even catalog data translated into some other form.
Well, I would think that would be a good idea, right? In that situation, you want to force somebody to a rule in a microservice, so you can do provenance around that.
Right, and so that's all going to be the choice of the curator who puts the templates in place, how that behaves.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Sorry, Rick, didn't mean to.
No,
not at all.
So
We're
still working on out all the little bugs and things, so this is good discussion.
So while you're there, though, we might as well then, unless you want to go ahead and do the demo.
No, go ahead.
So I was going to say, so with that structure in mind, how do you go about dealing with a scenario now of chaining templates together? I, for example, as a iRODS administrator, need to take a template that you wrote, Jason wrote, and Harold wrote, and I need to put them together in a specific order so that I can then force them on a set of users, either by individual users as a requirement or by a group under iRODS control. Has that been discussed?
We have discussed the ability of creating a metadata template by linking other metadata templates. So essentially, you can define a metadata template. This has certainly been discussed. I don't think it's in
there's a notion of binding, right?
Yeah.
So the templates are stored somewhere. In the reference implementation, we're storing them in iRODS,
Right.
just for now to not require something else. But you're not going to want to do that at scale. You're going to want to store them in some sort of external store, possibly. But so that it doesn't require you to
I
store them.
would argue that's bad policy as well because of race conditions.
Well, you can. Well, there are ways around that, but be that as it may.
Well, I'm arguing about the immutability, right? I don't want to get to the debate over it right now. I understand your point, but you got to remember your templates are now immutable objects.
Yeah, and that. Yeah.
So, okay.
Perfect. So, okay. So the idea is the templates are stored in a place, and you find a collection. You say, I want to bind this template to this collection. I want to bind this template to this collection, and it be required here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Add on to that, though, in the real world, there's also requirements that if you go into this collection, I have to bind you to template A, but if he goes to that collection, he needs to be bound to template B.
Right. So right now it is not that smart, but that's like that would be like essentially firing a rule to resolve the binding, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But right now the binding itself is in MU.
It's 1-to-1 and R2. Okay.
Yeah. But that's a good point. But yeah, you could have a resolver of the binding that just returns here right now, like the API you ask it, give me all the templates that are required for this target. If I put a data object here, tell me all the required templates.
Right.
And then it does a binding resolution.
Yeah, well, I think that would also be valuable because the other thing you're going to want to do as a user or an administrator, right? So what templates are bound to this thing, right?
Yeah, and yes, you can.
Right. So.
I had one other question.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I was thinking about validation and types and all of this stuff. Would it be possible to push all of that off onto JSON in some way? Like basically reserialize all the metadata into some JSON document and then just run the validator on that rather than having to write our own for every type?
JSON does not have terribly good type support.
No, you can't. Okay.
You'll be unhappy.
I'd be unhappy. Well, there's the answer. It would make me unhappy.
Yeah. So I mean, if we restricted it to the types that JSON supports,
Yeah.
then we'd be able to do that. But then we'd be frustrated at the limitations of the type system.
Okay, it's just not that good.
And
All right.
not to mention, if you think about eventual user-defined data types, you're going to have user-defined validators, right?
Yeah, well, same here with the jargon. That's why I was trying to think of ways around that, but it apparently will lead to sadness. So.
Yeah. I mean, it's a trade-off. If you want a more flexible type system, then if you want a more flexible type system, you need a more complex validation system.
Yeah, or take it out of iRODS.
The validation eventually needs to be pushed into the server core as microservices or what have you.
Sure.
So this is a case where you're sort of building something outside of the,
Right. Yeah.
The thing, yeah.
yeah. And then to see it eventually get
Okay.
moved into the core.
But to be honest with you, that's a rather interesting idea for why you may want to consider doing all this as a plugin, because plugins can evolve at their own pace and speed and not become a gate to releasing core. You guys are trying to release things out the door, right?
That's exactly. Yeah, that's it.
Sorry. I'm getting down into the weeds. I apologize.
No.
We're weed people though.
Yeah, we're the weedy sort of people.
Most of us are. Yeah, this is a room full of people who mostly live in the weeds. I don't know everyone, so there are. But just to talk about now, so we are implementing all of this as a REST API. So I'm going to show just some of that REST API. I'm going to show some of using the schema to actually validate templates. And I'm going to show a little bit of, we've got sort of two demos. We may have to switch computers. So I have a demo of something that we call FormBot, which is basically a layer up from the actual metadata templates code. So this is what would interface a template file with a user interface. So it has rendering hints information associated with it. So that's one of the things that I'm going to show as well. So we can come over here and use the advanced REST client.
Do you have the little swim lane to kind of point at what you're about to show?
Yes. Go away. So here is a complicated diagram that shows what would actually happen if you had an upload into a directory that has required metadata templates. So what the user does is uploads a file. And then this goes through 4 layers of code to actually do the things that they're trying to do. So the front end says, are there any required templates? Right? And then that goes down to the metadata templates, that's a function that's implemented in the metadata templates code. It builds a list of metadata templates from those files and gets the files from actually on disk. So Jargon is the Java library that accesses iRODS calls, essentially. So this is, we're now in iRODS land here. So we go get the actual files, we build a list. We build a list of representations of HTML forms in the form bod. So this is saying, this is where you're saying, I want you to try to render this as a slider. I want you to try to render this as a text box. Goes to the front end, which renders it and tells the user, populate these values. Then it again goes through, for each form, it calls execute on that form to actually apply, get a populated metadata template, validate the metadata template, execute it, write the AVUs onto the files on disk in the iRODS catalog, and then come back and display the results. So the demo that I'm going to show is sort of this slice, which goes between the metadata templates and the front end. Yes?
So Rick, quick question. In the model that you're using, templates bind to a collection and a collection only, correct? Not to individual files.
Correct. At the current moment.
I was about to ask you why there were the first 2 parts up there. I get it now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so right now, yeah, that's another interesting point. So we haven't discussed the idea of binding to more granular things. So the idea so far is you could say anything that goes in a collection gets a metadata template associated with it.
Yeah, or the other one, and Mike, forgive me, I was thinking though, usually what you would do is you would go through Jargon to query what's in the collection to begin with, like a stat command.
Right.
Instead of making the user ask every time when you go and get information about a collection, I'd return a flag that says, hey, you need to go look for the templates.
Okay.
That would cut down some overhead.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
So here we have the advanced REST client, which is a super neat piece of software that Google puts out that lets you test your REST interfaces. I'm just plugging it because I think it's great, not because we built it or anything. But so here, for example, I just have a Tomcat server running on my local machine, and I call build populated forms for this file. So I have test file 1.txt. I'm telling you, give me back the metadata templates that can be associated with this file, as well as any AVUs on the file. So it takes a little time, it comes back, and it produces this populated list. So it says that Dublin Core is one of the templates that can be associated with this file, and then it has all 14 elements of the Dublin Core metadata standard, with a current value, a default value, and a display value for each of those elements. So this is how the front end can say, this is the value that you've entered, this is the value that I'm validating against, and so on. So we have this list of all the metadata in Dublin Core. And then we also had this non-template AVU. So there was an AVU on the data object that doesn't fall into any of the templates associated with it. So we produced this second list of non-template AVUs for all the AVUs that are associated with the collection or data object or what have you, that don't belong in any of its metadata templates. So we don't lose that information. It's not like you can only use metadata templates to manage your metadata. If you wanted to put just a one-off, this is Rick's special metadata associated with a given data object, you can do that, and the front end is still smart enough to gather all those and marshal them and provide them in the user interface, even though we're sort of metadata template centric at the moment. And so it's just a matter of this one call that goes to the back end and does all these things. So we have, check to see if there are any required templates. So this is the one function call that goes over here and builds the list of JSON representations and gives you a renderable list, essentially, of metadata templates and metadata elements.
Are there hints for what kind of widgetry to use for
Yes.
each of the things?
So there are at least default hints. You may be able to make them smarter or override them. But for example, there is knowledge in the metadata templates or in FormBot that says, oh, this is a list of strings.
Yeah.
I want to render that as a list of text boxes. Go ahead.
No, so there's a quick question. So FormBot is intended to be a separate application that does this process by querying through Jargon to iRODS?
It just calls the whole idea of FormBot is, we started going with this as we started talking about the cloud browsers. There's lots of places where if it's an iRODS rule, can I determine its input parameters and create just a form based on the data that's in iRODS. So FormBot is kind of like this intermediate layer that's more centered on the cloud browser, which was just more dealing with the problem of creating forms generated from stuff that's in the iRODS catalog.
The reason I'm asking is that I'm just sitting here thinking about this on massive scale out properties. It's a lot of overhead in that one item. If it's buried into iRODS, that's going to be a big performance hit.
Right, and so there's a lot to discuss in that area. First is, as you're saying, to resolve the template. Well, Rick, why don't you take a shot?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Just keep on going.
So we also have over here, this isn't super interesting to look at right now, but this is the REST API, not for FormBot, but for the actual metadata template API. So we have sort of two layers of REST APIs. We have the FormBot API, which is really just for something that's displaying a front end. So the cloud browser would make FormBot calls, for example, or potentially Metalinks if it's re-architected someday. I don't know, but
Not hard to add.
but we also have this lower level REST API that accesses the metadata template function call directly, which is actually no, this is the FormBot. I need to open the.
So getting back to the scale out thing, these things can basically just be wrapped up as traditional microservices.
What I'm going through in my head is we were looking at this problem right in the Metalinks world. We decided to go the fine leaf route, thinking we could put servers in place to deal with the overhead caused by scale out. We literally are doing what you're doing with FormBot. We put it in the service layer of our UI and get it off the end client so that it's sitting on something that I can scale in the cloud a bit better.
Sure.
As long as you kind of keep that concept with this, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. We have a different argument about whether we should have the server interface talking to a FormBot but that's,
Right. This is like microservices. These are like just microservices that are REST calls, and they can scale horizontally. But then we also want to look at things like caching strategies, so you can you only need to cache those templates.
Right. Well, again, I was just worrying about it from the standpoint of the impact on iRODS as the core server, right?
This shouldn't touch iRODS, especially like you access it once and it goes in a distributed cache.
Well, that's why I was also talking about pushing the metadata templates out into something else that might, scale better for the UI.
I'm not going to say anything. It's what we did.
So that's why. Yeah. I think that's what Cybers did too.
So so there's a lot of ways to attack that.
Rick, please keep going. Sorry.
Oh, it's not a problem at all. No need to apologize. But so this is the beginnings of a REST API that exposes the lower level functionality associated with the metadata templates code themselves. So this is exposing this layer. So if you're writing anything that's a lower level piece of code, you would use that API rather than going through the FormBot API that has extra overhead. So we've exposed basically all of the resolver functionality, the create, update, delete functionality is currently in this big old Swagger file that we have going on here. And we can find, for example, all the metadata, all the public templates, all the available templates, all the templates bound to a given path, and so on. So this is going to be built out so that we also expose the validation framework, and we also expose the parser, and we also expose the exporter, so that you could write a program that interacts with metadata templates without using anything other than REST API calls. So you could write it in Java or whatever your language of choice is.
So I'll ask now, this is the appropriate place, the ugly question no one wants to hear me ask. So how do we deal with putting ACLs around templates?
Well, if they're data objects within iRODS, you already have ACLs.
Then the list that I can pull back has to be authenticated? even
Well,
if
it
goes
will
outside
end up being a
iRODS?
query. That's one of the reasons we're doing within iRODS is everything is a query. So iRODS ACLs as they impact data and metadata are still at play.
Okay. No, I'm
For all the
absolutely agreeing.
pluses
I'm
and
absolutely
minuses
agreeing.
of
with
that.
that.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking the one side effect of that, of course, is that if a template is chained and the chained template doesn't have the right permissions and your chain's broken, that's something that has to be dealt with. And I think that's going to be important because templates can be used to find out or discover where PII is.
Well, and we can probably write a chain validation.
Right. So I think most of the templates themselves are like a schema. So the idea would be that templates would be in a publicly readable area.
Yeah, but just what I'm trying to tell you, I can already talk to people who have use case scenarios where that is not the case.
Right.
The schemas themselves need to be
They, just like
Locked
metadata,
down.
have to be locked down.
And so using this approach, you can. If you move that to an external store, well, then you're in different territory. And this is where maybe starting to have virtual paths in iRODS that talk to other things like /users and so forth is fun. But
Yeah, I think that abstraction's there. We just haven't exercised anything,
So you're saying I need to work on how to build a WannaCry for iRODS, huh?
So you got to come up with the answers before you ask the question. That's the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Wisconsin already did that.
Hmm.
They broke iRODS with iRODS.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
Oh,
That story.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll turn the recording off.
Yeah, can we? It's parking lot conversation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can pretty much do that. I'm essentially through this. Mike has a little demo of the Metadata Templates API. I don't know if we want to look at it, but
it's kind of starting to tread the same ground.
okay.
I guess the thing to say is there is a metadata templates working group. And where we are is a lot of the basic mechanisms are there for this first cut, and really the group task to me is fleshing out that schema, throwing use cases at it, and then designing these API, what are the paths and the verbs that we want to map. And so that's like the province of this metadata templates working group. The other thing I want to say is that there's another half to this, which is indexing. So it's one thing to store the AVUs in iRODS, but iRODS is a terrible place to query your data. And so the point would be that if you can put structured metadata in iRODS as AVUs, let iRODS manage your metadata through policy, but then you can project a collection out to an indexer. So this index and the subtree is projected out to Elasticsearch. So there's this idea of a small bit of code that can interpret the stored metadata and put it into Elasticsearch or into a triple store. We've populated
For things that can be in a public place. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, again, the ACL problem around metadata and the templates becomes very real in that scenario.
That's right. That is very true. And honestly, a lot of the stuff that we're doing involves public catalogs and discoverability of science data. But yes, so there are other cases.
Give you an example. I was on with a major research institute in this country 2 hours ago, and this is the core issue that they have
Sure.
and why they've thrown 2 commercial products out the door.
Right.
You're their last hope. Versus rolling their own.
Well,
So, I'm not trying to sit here and say what you're doing is wrong or incorrect. I'm just trying to tell you this problem is getting more and more real with every passing month.
So you would have to address that using things like jQuery or things that are under the policy
Exactly.
umbrella.
Exactly. But the idea that metadata or templates can be kept and held around and not have the ACLs with the actual object tied to them. In fact, I've even seen use case now where certain portions of metadata need to have ACL sets that are different than the rest of the metadata against the object. In other words, more restricted metadata than the object itself has restricted on it.
we can do that now with 4.2 and the
Yeah.
dynamic policy enforcement.
Yeah.
Police, so.
But these are the problems that you're getting ready to see more and more. Let's talk about something more fun now for a moment. Okay, so let's talk about how you would use this technology to build the other requests we hear a lot of, which is how do I create a metadata dictionary? In other words, I want to be able to set, no, you're setting it down in the template itself. This is a general user kind of scenario where an administrator want to set a dictionary for all the metadata attribute names that are available, and yet users themselves within their projects may want to set their own. And these are not people who are going to sit down and write the necessary JSON to do this stuff. They won't know how.
So you're saying they need a user interface to...
Well, we build a user interface. I'm more interested into how I keep a dictionary that's available to build templates out of so that the right values are chosen when the template is built.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought this would be a lot more fun. We've wasted hours arguing this point.
So your question is about the construction of templates, and really it's more about the curator who is creating the template being able to select from the catalog of elements to place in the template, and making essentially the crosswalk as they create the template.
For an administrator, but in the real world, research scientists want to create their own templates for use in their own projects without having, no offense meant, IT administrators are going to become fewer and fewer than you're used to seeing today. All of this is going to be automated within 5 years. If you can't do it yourself, forget it. We're seeing that in spades in the actual world of hyper-converged infrastructure data centers. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get into commercial pitch, but you know, I've seen organizations which might have had 15 IT administrators 5 years ago down to 2. And they're all going to get to 0 if they can do it within the next 2 years, either by going to AWS or doing it in-house. So the idea that you're going to have a data curator who's anything other than the research scientist is not going to be real in a few years.
Thank God we can automate this stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's always my understanding. Is just like if it's not automated, it's not happening.
But that's the reason I'm asking the question this way, right? Somebody might build one initial database or dictionary, but then everybody else has got to use out of it.
So
There's not anybody there to do it.
zones themselves can have metadata. So, I mean, you can basically pin your dictionary to the zone itself.
So then create the dictionary as a JSON object tied to the zone, and
Lockdown.
or tied to zones and groups, perhaps.
Well,
Part of this too is coming up with a good concept for where iRODS stops and other things begin. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
that changes on every deployment. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one thing I've...
That's the picture we're drawing
Yeah.
right now, is to try and explain to people how big it can be
Yeah.
in their existing.
And this is why I push more for thinking of these things in microservice architecture, not the
Right.
Not
former,
the-
but the, like the
right.
new, more shiny.
Sure.
That there are things outside of iRODS, and how can we most make iRODS amenable for working with those things? You know.
Well, yeah, I mean, the tension there is everything Steve says is ACLs. So, I mean, at some point, you know, you're talking about iRODS as nothing more than the API that all the microservices are going to have to route back through to make sure people are allowed to do stuff.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to suggest that there won't be a data curator. There will be that job or that role, but they're likely not going to be IT experts in the future is what we would project. So
Sure.
they can set up the topology for the templates or the ontologies or everything else is going to be used, but a lot of the background stuff once it's put together, as you already are doing with Docker images, so we're just going to be scaled out with a Puppet script and away you go.
I'm still trying to understand the use case here. It really seems like everyone's a curator. We have one person entering data in per data object that's going in. Is that really the...
You mean for metadata templates as a concept?
I would... Yeah.
The people,
What I'm
the people,
hearing-
the group defining the templates will be 1 to small, and then the people adding metadata could be 1 to everybody. So
So you have data that is ingested, and in order to maintain metadata that can be properly curated, we create these templates that say what metadata is allowed to be applied, what and anything possibly isn't, and what is required.
And at that point, I'm with you, and I get
Mhm.
it. So, but where this, and that's great if that's where this is going. But the thought of having a single curator come in and just I'm hearing the form bot, and that makes me think of forms, and then one person sitting there in front of a screen entering in for every data object. When I have a situation where I'll have someone coming in and putting 7 to 384 files in at one time, they're not going to want to go through and enter.
Right. And this actually,
yeah.
So I'm just trying. I haven't made that leap here with what you've been showing.
well, the idea is that metadata templates can also help solve that problem of adding 384 files at a time, because you can have either a fully or a partially populated metadata template that contains either just default values or actual final values for a bunch of metadata elements. So if you have someone that's uploading a bunch of files, you can present them with a template that says, okay, you need to have, what metadata is the same for all of these files? Or what metadata is either the same or can be automatically derived from each of the files. Right, and you could have them put in that information, and then it would automatically populate for all 380 data objects. They have the same author, and they were created at the same time, and the file size is the file size on each of them, for example. There might still be some metadata that you would have to enter manually for all 380. I'm not sure. There may be a use case where you have to provide a brief description, and you just have to do that per file. I don't know.
So it can serve as an accelerant for certain cases. It can serve as a bouncer and not let you in at all if certain things aren't, the required fields aren't full. And then it can serve as the validation later and come along and identify where you're missing your stuff that we kind of care about, but we're not going to force you to do it.
And there's like 2 modalities that might help. So like one modality is the metadata template can be a way of binding a program that runs when that file hits. So when the file hits, the metadata template says, when this file hits, here's a process for you to run. And the process goes off and runs, and then the metadata template is really just binding the output parameters of that process to ADUs. So it's a way of dynamically almost putting a policy in there. So you could, for example, set that metadata at the collection level, and then you run a little process. So a file hits, it runs a process, gets that metadata, and shoves it in ADUs on the data object. And you could use that to sort of dynamically create a policy that does it.
Or if you want to go back to what I was showing last month, right, the rudimentary template we got, you can fill in the default values. He's saying, where I would have had a default value, add in a program or a microservice name or something.
Yeah.
of that nature.
So put the AVs on the template, say run this rule when a file hits, it runs it, takes those parameters and shoves them on the data object. It could be that simple as just parroting it. You could achieve the same effect by saying, honestly, just start thinking about that other part, which is the indexing, which just says when a file hits, it fires off the policy enforcement point. and that policy enforcement point says, oh, it's in this collection, so take this data after the fact and propagate it to the data object in that collection. Or never do that and just push it out to whatever index you're using, Elasticsearch or something like that. So it's a general way that gets you maybe to like inside of the finish line, and then it gives you a couple tools to express that as a policy, either at the time of data entry or asynchronously after the fact.
But we never know what people are going to want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think
They don't know what they want to do.
the
I mean,
I don't know what I want to do.
No, we don't either.
So the hard part about this is that we're addressing
Yeah.
sort of half a dozen use cases with one tool and trying to explain that all at once. And I may not have done a good job at sort of breaking down the different things that metadata templates can do. Because, yeah, like Carol was saying, it can be an accelerant if you're dealing with lots of large files. You can say, I want these 5 metadata elements to appear on everything I ever upload, so I never have to type them again. And that's one thing that you can do with metadata templates. You can also go the other way, where it's pure validation, and you have to type stuff every time. And not only do you have to type stuff every time, we're going to make sure that you're typing the right stuff every time. And we're going to be jerks about it. And those are both use cases of sort of the same tool in metadata templates.
So Rick, you just made me think of a question I should have asked earlier. How do we tie this to an actual I put I command?
I'm really against that.
But if you don't, I can go around the system.
Well, what I was proposing is more the idea of staging areas. So the file goes into a staging area with a final
Again,
destination.
you got to think legal providence. I can get around that. That's not an enforcement.
Okay.
With the dynamic policy enforcement points, we can stop you from putting data that does not have conforming metadata. And iPut does support an atomic metadata action. So if the appropriate key value pairs are not shipped with the data, the pre-PEP, if you will, for put
Will that
can
be the
validate
default?
that against that. What's that?
Will that be the default in future versions of iRODS?
It'd be a policy.
That
That's a really good point. That's a really good point, because like
The only good
By the way,
default policy
I'm not
is
trying to
you
back
have
out in the
one.
corner. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
poke to think
No.
about this kind of a problem, because
that's a good point.
I totally agree with what you're saying to do, but there are going to be users who need that to know that you can handle the policy enforcement at the very low level. So that's the reason I asked.
We absolutely can.
Good.
The question is packaging and polish, which is always the problem with systems like these.
Well, again, bear in mind, going to the question you were just asking, right? What you're doing here is providing the programming tools necessary to build the flexibility the world needs. That's different
Right.
from presenting it in a pretty.
Yeah, it's not a product. It's
That's
a
right.
technology. I've said that.
Yeah, otherwise it's like the Swiss Army knife with the 50 blades, like the on the carousel.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the really sharp knives. Here.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah.
Pardon me, I better remember that analogy. That's a good one. Well, this is fantastic, Rick. You've done a great job here.
Thank you.
If anybody will allow me to go on public on the recording, we took a look at what we were doing, because we were still very huge believers in separating the execution of a template from validation of metadata to building of data dictionaries. And I can't see that the method we were trying to implement is better or worse than this, so I think we just go with this one. We've stopped working on what we were doing.
The question will be coverage of use cases, and that's what that metadata templates working group is looking like. And by no means do we think we've got all the
Right. And I'm going to take the minutes from the March meeting, and then, now that these things are published in public and have URLs and homes and things, start pointing to them and talk about these use cases on the working group site. So there's a place for this conversation to happen.
Well, one of the things I would definitely recommend you do is to ask people and request them to give you as many different use cases as they can think of. Because that's where, at least we discovered as we were looking into this, going out and talking to folks. And you'll get a lot of data next week in Boston if you start asking.
Right.
That's where we came up with the thinking that we needed to separate the three actions, because some people wanted rigid data dictionary, some wanted to be able to just put user-defined the validation around data items as they created them, and others wanted a hybrid. It's like, oh my gosh, how do you put a single switch in place to do that? In fact, I didn't even really bring that topic up in here because I think this is flexible enough. Most people can live within the constraints that it has.
So users can have their own templates,
Right.
store them in iRODS,
Right.
and no one else ever sees them.
Right. And they can apply to their local collections.
Their stuff.
That's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
And it gets away with the problem I argued about at the last meta meeting, is that when we were going out talking to people, anything that provides 3 sets of templates to choose from in the hierarchy is one too many. No one can figure out how they get linked together. Right? I mean, you've got a template that applies to the whole system, and then you can have one that applies to each directory. But as we went out working with user,
It's too much.
yeah, and when we hit 3, we could see people try to draw directory trees where they couldn't figure out which templates were in effect.
And so this assumes like it walks up the tree to the parent, and the closest templates win, if that makes sense, is how it's.
CTW.
That's not acceptable. There has to be a template at the system level that is enforceable by law. No one can touch it, no one can get around it.
Well, that's a use case that needs to be, so that's easy to do.
Right.
It's all like when you say list the bound templates, it's like what is the algorithm you use? So currently the algorithm is closest.
Actually, we argued having it both ways. We were going to have a contingency flag, right? Top wins, bottom wins. You can do both if you wanted to. That's another possible outcome.
And I think the key is to just sort of structure the API calls, and then you can play with the inner behavior. Like if you can capture like what are the main user gestures? List templates bound to this path. List so.
Well, I think what you've done just says a couple of little tweaks are going to hit 90% of the use cases we got hit with when we started poking around at this. So you're in really good shape. So, Rick, we know you're leaving, but congratulations.
Yeah. So I'm done. I'm happy to talk more if anybody has questions or thoughts or anything. But otherwise, have a cookie and enjoy the rest of your evening.